I am the Commodore Amiga 500 home computer. Dazzling animation at your command. I am the Commodore Amiga 500, a multitasking home office in your hand. I am the Commodore Amiga 500, total home video you control, and arcade quality games in stereo. And now, you can be everything I am.
Many other models available. See your full-service authorized dealer, Modern Business Machines.
CGQ Plus.
Okay, so I mentioned on Twitter yesterday that I was thinking about making sort of a quick walk-around video for the Amiga 500 here, just because maybe like me, you grew up in the US and you're not particularly familiar with the computer. The Amiga sold less than 1 million total units here in the US, so it really wasn't too popular. Just real quick, I did mention this a long time ago on an episode of CGQ&A. I got this computer as a gift from my friend Todd. Todd runs the channel Todd's Nerd Cave, but he and I have been just sort of internet friends since before either one of us had YouTube channels. But I've thanked him many times before, but I'll just take the opportunity to thank him yet again for this extremely generous gift. So just to go over, this obviously is not meant to be some kind of substitute for the type of video that I would do on my other channel, but just real briefly to just give a little bit of backstory with the Amiga. The Amiga 500 came out in 1987, both in the US and in the UK. Here in the US, it retailed for $699, which is about $1,500 or so, adjusted for inflation. And all you got in the box was the computer itself, and I believe it came with a mouse. It didn't come with a monitor, because you were expected to either buy that separately, or as I'll show you when we go around the back, you had options if you wanted to just hook this up to a normal television, rather than having a dedicated RGB monitor for it. At its core is a Motorola 68000 processor, and that's the same processor that, at least for me, is most famous for being in the Sega Genesis and Sega Mega Drive. When you bought an Amiga, it came stock with just 512K of RAM, but most games that you would want to play on the Amiga now came out a little bit later, and by then they required a full meg of RAM to run. So most Amiga 500s that you'll find have been upgraded in one way or another to 1 meg of RAM. You could either do that, there was ways to upgrade the RAM on the motherboard, or there's a little trap door underneath the system where you can put an expansion module, and it was very common for people to put, I think it was called a 501, Amiga 501 module. I might not have that correct. That gave the system an extra 512K of RAM, and also gave it a battery-backed real-time clock. So one thing you'll notice about the Amiga 500 is the keyboard. The keyboard looks very similar to like a normal IBM PC keyboard as far as the way it's laid out. And then I'll just show you, just for comparison's sake, like here is what a Commodore 64 keyboard looks like, which is much more reminiscent, I would say, of like a classic era computer, like, maybe like the Apple II or a Tandy color computer or something like that. Much more of an old school look. As far as the keys themselves, they don't really feel that much different between the two. They're very linear. Most keyboards back in the day, I don't think felt all that great. I think like the Apple IIc had a pretty nice keyboard on it, but none of them were really going to win any awards. So anyway, now we'll just take a little quick tour just around the sides of the Amiga so you can kind of see what's on it. And then I'm going to show you what accessories that I have that I use with it. And then that's pretty much going to wrap up the video. So on this side, you've got, I know the light's not great, you've got a built-in floppy drive. The only other computer I can think of off the top of my head that was one of these all-in one or integrated keyboard computers. Obviously, if you bought like a IBM PC or a computer, a higher-end computer, it was going to have a floppy drive, of course, but like the Commodore 64 didn't have an integrated floppy drive, and none of the earlier Apple IIs had them. The Apple IIc, which came out in '84, was kind of famous for having its built-in floppy drive, but most computers of this ilk did not. So that was a cool feature to have, just because it helped keep the footprint small. but it was also added value. You know, this computer was $700 when it came out, but you could just buy the computer and you were good to go. You didn't need to buy an external floppy drive. All right, sorry, I'm redoing this whole part of the video because I didn't have image stabilization turned on, and so the camera was kind of shaky. So we're just going to real quick go through all the ports on the back of the computer. The first one you've got here says mono. I don't know if you can read any of these, but that says mono, and that's not referring to monaural audio, but rather to monochrome video. I don't really understand why they didn't build in a color composite video output, but they didn't. Next to that, you have the RGB video output jack. And this is RGB video just like the RGB video that's outputted by old game consoles. Like I could plug this into a Sony PVM, or I could plug it into one of my upscalers like an OSSC or a FrameMeister, but you cannot plug that directly into a VGA monitor unless you have like an NEC multisync that can take that 15 kilohertz signal. The other thing that you could buy, though, when you bought one of these Amigas back in the day, is you could buy their Amiga 520 adapter, which was this adapter thing that was probably about 5 or 6 inches long that would plug in right here. And that would give you color composite video out. And it also had a built-in RF modulator so that you could plug it into any television. So probably a lot of people did that because if you wanted to buy the monitor that went with this computer, it was about $300 and maybe even a little bit more than that. That was the Commodore 1084 and then later the 1084S, which had stereo sound. Next to that, you've just got the power jack. Here you've got the parallel port and the serial port. And probably most commonly, you would plug in, say, a printer and external modem into the parallel and serial ports. Next to that, you have the disk drive port, which will allow you to add an external disk drive. And in fact, it'll allow you to add up to 3 external disk drives because they daisy chain together. Next to that, you have line level stereo out. So you plug just normal RCA cables into those ports and plug it into external speakers or a stereo receiver. Next to that, you have not 1 but 2 joystick ports, which is nice for a couple reasons. First of all, you could play a 2-player game with somebody if you had 2 joysticks and have them both plugged in without needing some kind of external adapter or anything. The way this is probably most commonly used is that on the Amiga, you plug your mouse into one of the joystick ports, unlike a PC where, of course, the mouse would plug into the serial port. So most common configuration probably for most people, and certainly when I have it plugged in, is that I have a joystick plugged into one port and I have a mouse plugged into the other port. And then lastly over here, you've got these 2 switches, and these switches were added by Todd. So this is the only real modification that I know of that the computer has. The first one, as you can see, says 50 hertz, 60 hertz. And that's basically putting the system into like PAL mode and NTSC mode. So 50 hertz is PAL mode, 60 hertz is NTSC mode. Most Amiga software was really was written to be run on a PAL system. So I just always have it stuck on 50, and that way everything runs at the proper speed. Although I know some people, like for certain games, you can switch into 60 hertz mode and it'll speed up the game. And so if you're looking for like some added challenge, then you could do that. The other one here, you can see it says DF0 external or DF0 internal. And what that refers to is which drive is going to be the boot drive. And for just the stock Amiga, the internal floppy drive is always the boot drive. So you would put your OS disk in there if you were just going to boot into something like Workbench, or if you were going to play a game, you'd stick that in the floppy drive and it would boot the game. But if you wanted to boot from an external drive, you couldn't do that unless you install something like this. And so I have this installed, and you'll see that it's set to DF0 external, and that's because I always boot this system from an external drive, and you'll see why in just a minute. And then just real quick, just the accessories that I have that we use. Todd, of course, included a SCART cable, RGB SCART cable. I don't think anyone needs me to show them the SCART cable. He also sent a mouse, and that is just this Logitech It's actually an optical mouse, and you might be thinking, well, how the heck do you use that on an Amiga? And that's because he included this little adapter that you can just buy on eBay, and that will adapt any PS2 mouse to an Amiga. And then as far as the floppy drive thing goes, the reason that I boot from an external drive is that Todd also included this Gotek floppy drive emulator. It's pretty common for people to take these drives and stick them in the Amiga, but I think you have to shave down part of the case in there. And so it's kind of suboptimal, but it's either that or you have to do the modification to set DF0 to be the external drive instead of the internal. So no matter what, you're going to have to do some work on your computer to get this to work. But this has this little USB thumb drive plugged into the front, and that thumb drive is just chock full of disk images of, mostly games, but also like demos, like audio-visual demos and other types of software like Workbench or productivity software. I mean, he packed it full of pretty much anything you could ever want. And when you fire up the computer, this thing boots, and you get like a menu that pops up, and you just pick what disk images you want to load. I'll kind of show that more when we do the live stream, so there's not too much point in talking about it at length right now. And then the last thing, we're just wrapping up. The last thing is obviously you have to have a joystick. And there were a number of joysticks that people used with the Amiga. Probably, especially if you were in Europe, the most common joystick was the Competition Pro joystick, but there were a number of other joysticks that were made. The Amiga is, backwards compatible with Commodore 64 joysticks, but the C64 only supported a one-button joystick, whereas the Amiga supports a two-button joystick. So, yes, you could use Commodore 64 joysticks with it, but if you were playing a game that required two action buttons, then that wasn't going to work very well. So, the joystick that I use, well, it's a controller, really. The controller that I use is a Neo-Geo CD pad, and you might wonder, like, why of all things would I use that? Now, of course, the Neo-Geo CD pad is a cool pad. Instead of having a D-pad, it has this little sort of thumb joystick that has the micro switches in it, and that's pretty neat. But the main reason I use this is just that Neo-Geo controllers don't have multiplexer chips in them, and I don't want to, muddy things up too much by explaining what all that means. But it basically just means that for every button or direction or anything else that's in here, there's one wire going through the cable. Using something like a Neo-Geo controller, it's just easier to adapt it for use with other things that also don't use multiplexer chip. So that's why I use that. But then the one sort of modification that I made is not actually a modification to the controller itself, but rather to the adapter. So obviously I had to make an adapter to get the 15-pin Neo-Geo connector, which looks like that, in order to plug that into the 9-pin port on the back of the Amiga. And so I just made this adapter. I tied two of the pins together, and the two pins I tied together are up here and this A button. So I set C and D to be like button 1 and button 2 for the joystick, and I tied the A button into up. And you might ask, well, why in the world would you want to do that? Well, because the Commodore 64 only had the one action button on the joystick, if you were playing any kind of game that required like jumping, like let's say you're playing a Super Mario Brothers style game, like a platformer, or a side-scrolling action game like Turrican, if you set the joystick button to be jump, then you didn't have an action button to do anything else with. And so it's very common on the Commodore 64 and on the Amiga that they use the up direction for jumping. And for me, it's not really all that enjoyable, and it's kind of hard to get used to. But there was an easy solution for that by tying up and A together. So like now with this joystick, you can still push up and it still works as up, but you can also push A for up. So like when I'm playing a game like Turrican, I've got the C button here is button 1. So that is to shoot your weapon. D is for the special weapon. and then A is for jump. So, it's perfect. And then there's like some driving games where you had to push up or forward for the gas, and that way you've got a gas pedal there. So anyway, that's why I have that. And I just think, for me at least, as cool as it would be to have like a competition pro joystick, just because that is the classic Amiga joystick, I'm extremely happy with this as my solution. The B, just in case anybody was going to ask. So the B button and then select and start, those 3 buttons are not wired into anything in the adapter, so they just don't do anything. Okay, so I figure I would just sign off by showing you what the system looks like when it's all set up, because I was basically just getting ready for tomorrow night's live stream, so this is what my desk is going to look like. So here's the Amiga all set up. You can see that the floppy drive emulator is on, and hopefully it's focusing, and you can see that it says Turrican on the little screen there, and that's because Turrican is what is playing on the PVM. So as usual, the video is being output from the Amiga and going into the PVM, out of the PVM, up into this OSSC upscaler, and then out of the OSSC via DVI, and then it goes into a, see, there's me, into a USB 3.0 capture device, and then this is what the layout's going to look like in OBS tomorrow night. So that's about it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this semi-quick tour of this Amiga, which once again comes to the show courtesy of Todd. Thanks again, Todd. And I will see you guys tomorrow night, where one of the games we'll be playing is in fact Turrican.